Hello programmers! Welcome to another Introduction to Java tutorial. In this tutorial we will be focusing on variables, specifically what variables are in programming, and additionally how to program variables in Java. So without further ado, let's get started. Now you may have heard of variables in your math class. Perhaps you've had to solve a problem like 2x plus 5 equals y, and then find the exact value of x, or you've had to do other mathematical calculations involving various variables. Well, variables act very similarly in programming. I'm going to give you the following analogy to help you understand variables in Java. So imagine you have a box, and this box can only contain one particular type of thing, and this box has a name. So here on the screen, we have a box, and I'm going to name my box my var. var being short for variable. Now, take note of the way I named my variable. I had the first letter of my variable name set to be lowercase because that is a naming convention that programmers follow in Java. And additionally, I also use camel case for all words following in the rest of the name. So now that we have named our box, what can we put in our box? Well, it depends on what type of box we're talking about. In this case, let's just say we're dealing with an integer type of variable. So we can only put integers into our box, but we could put any integer into our box. So we could throw a 5 into the box, and now we have a box called myvar that contains an integer that is a value of 5. Or we could get rid of that 5, and we could replace it with a 7, or a 2000, or whatever number you want to put into the integer. Additionally, we could change the type of the box. What if we want a box that is not containing integers, but instead holds things like characters? In that case, let's just come up with a new box. So let's erase this. Let's just say we have created a new box. We're going to call it my char var, short for my character variable. Notice again with the name, I kept that first letter lowercase, and then I followed the camel case convention. Now what I'm going to do is I can put any character I want into my variable. I can put A into my variable. I can put B into my variable. I can do whatever I want. And this is how a variable operates in programming. It's quite simply a value that we give a name and then we can access throughout our program. So, with that said, let's learn about the different types of variables. Java has two main types of variables. There's primitive data types, and then there's other types of variables. So primitive data types are quite simply tiny bits of information, just one single piece of information that is stored directly in memory. Very simple. And there are 8 different types of primitive data types in Java. So these being Boolean, byte, char, short, int, long, float, and double. Let's talk about some of the important ones. So first of all, we have Boolean. This is true or false. So the only two things that you can set a Boolean variable to are true or false. Let's talk about char, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which is a character. So we can put one character in, like an A, or B, or C, or any letter. And then we have int, which is short for integer, and we can put basically any whole number into that variable. And then we have float and double, which are very similar. For our purposes here, we're going to be using double today. And double is a decimal value. So if I wanted to store a value like 5.5 or 6.7, I would use a double. Let's talk about the other types of variables that we have in Java. So there are things like strings and arrays. String just so happens to be an array of characters, but you don't know that yet. We'll get to that in a later tutorial. Just know that while they might behave somewhat similarly to the primitive data types, they are, on the ground fundamental level, very different, and they're a bit more complex. But for today's purposes, we're going to stick to working with these 4 primitive data types and also string. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and open up our IDE or whatever application you're using to program your Java programs, and let's get started with programming these in Java. Alright everyone, so as you can see, I've flipped over to my IDE. Once again, I am using Eclipse, and now let's program some variables in Java. So first off, let's start off with an integer variable. So in order to declare an integer variable, what you'll need to do is declare the type of the variable, which in our case is int, and then name the variable. So I'm going to call it my int var. And right then and there, you could end the variable declaration just with a semicolon. And this would successfully create an integer variable called my int var. However, the variable itself would have no value assigned to it. So going back to our box analogy, this would be an empty box with a name. If we wanted to put something into that box, we would quite simply type equals and then whatever number we want to put in. So, for example, 5, right before the semicolon. Now we have successfully created an integer variable called myIntVar and assigned it a value of 5. Typically, what you're going to want to do when creating variables is assign them a value, at least initially, because let's say later on in your program, you want to manipulate that variable, or you want to add 5. If you didn't already have something in your variable to begin with, the computer wouldn't know what to add 5 to. Hence, you want to have your variable start with some sort of a value. So, we have assigned our integer variable a value of 5. Let's move on to another type of variable. So how about we program a double? So in order to do that, we'd first declare the type. So we write double, and then my double var. You don't need to name it my whatever the type is var. You can name it whatever, but I'm just using this for simplicity's sake and to keep track of what type of variable we'll be using. So let's assign a value of 5.2 to my double var, because why not? Now you have successfully assigned a double or created a double variable. Next, let's move on to char or character. So once again, write out the type char, my char var, and then in order to denote a character, we use single quotes. So get a pair of single quotes and then put a character in there. So B or maybe A. Take note of when using char, you're going to want to only use one character. Char is not like a string, which we'll talk about later, where you can have a sequence of characters or multiple words or one word. With a char, you can only keep track of one character since it is just for character. Okay, we've done char, int, and double. Now let's talk about Boolean. So once again, if we want to declare a Boolean variable, we declare the type, Boolean, and then let's call it my Boolean var, and then let's assign it a value, which in this case can either be true or false. My bad. And in Java, what you're going to want to do is leave that true or false lowercase. I know in some other programming languages you might want to leave that uppercase, but in Java in particular, true or false is always going to be a lowercase. There we go. We've assigned a Boolean value. Now let's move on to a more complex type of variable. Let's assign a string. So it's actually very similar to assigning a primitive data type. All we need to do in order to create a string variable is type string, and then my string var, and then we use double quotes for strings, and we can type in a whole sentence, hello world, or whatever text we want. And you'll notice that, at least in my IDE, string is not purple like the other primitive data types. That's because the software is recognizing that these are all primitive data types. This is not a primitive data type. This is actually a class of its own, but we'll talk about that in a future tutorial. Now, let's talk about how do you manipulate these variables. We have now assigned values to each of these variables and created each of these variables, but what if we want to change them? Well, it's actually very simple. If you would like to reassign a variable, all you need to do is type out the name of said variable. So for example, if we want to rename my Boolean var, and we want to set it to false instead of true, all we need to say is equals and then false. This is because, unlike in your math classes, equals in programming is used to assign values, not to say that they are equivalent. So when I use this equals, the computer understands this as this is a value that I want to assign to this variable. Let's go ahead and try and reassign a numeric variable. So let's do my int var equals 2. Now we have reassigned our integer variable. Now you might be wondering, how do I do math with my program? How do I manipulate integer variables so that I can do basic functions like add, subtract, multiply, divide, maybe raise something to the power of, or square root something? Well, let's go ahead and talk about that. Let's start learning with integers. So if you would like to add to a variable that has a number value, it's very simple. One of the easiest ways to do this is to write the name of your variable. So let's go with the myIntVar. MyIntVar equals, because we want to assign a new value to it, and then type myIntVar plus 2, semicolon, because in Java we usually put a semicolon at the end of our lines of programming. Okay, so how is the computer going to understand this statement? Well, it's very simple. The computer is going to say, look, I've got this variable called myIntVar, and I'm reassigning it because it is equals. Now, I'm reassigning it something plus 2. I'm assigning it myIntVar, specifically, plus 2. So what is myIntVar? Well, it's going to go to myIntVar and see what is the value of myIntVar. And right here in line 18, we assign the value of myIntVar to be 2. So it's going to say, okay, I am going to replace myIntVar right here with a 2. And then it's going to add this 2 right here. And then it's going to do the math and figure out that 2 plus 2 is 4. And it's going to reassign myIntVar to have a value of 4. So now we have successfully added 2 to myIntVar. There's another easier way to do this. So you can just simply type myIntVar plus equals 2, or any number. I could type in 10, and it would add 10 to myIntVar. So that's an even simpler way to write a addition line of code. All right, now let's talk about a different mathematical operator. For example, let's talk about subtraction. So let's say I want to subtract 5 from myIntVar. So what I need to do, I need to type out myIntVar equals myIntVar minus 5. Boom. We have now successfully subtracted 5 from myIntVar. In case you're wondering if this line of code or something similar to this line of code can be used for subtraction, indeed it can. We can type out myIntVar plus minus 10, minus equals 10, and that should do the trick. I see there we go. I had unfortunately I had a typo in my the name of my variable, hence the computer was unable to recognize which variable I was referring to. Okay, now that we have subtracted and added, how about we talk about other mathematical operators? For example, multiplication or addition. For our purposes, just so we don't have to retype all this, how about we copy this line, put it down here. It's very simple. Just use asterisk for multiplication, or use this slash for division. Each of these lines, this line right here, would multiply myIntVar by 5, and this would divide myIntVar by 5. Let's go to some more complex mathematical operations. For example, let's say we want to square root 25. So just for the heck of it, let's go ahead and store 25 into a variable. So let's make a variable called let's make a variable called 25 written out as text, and then let's go ahead and assign it the type of double. So double 25.0, because doubles are, of course, decimal values, and so we have double 25 equals 25.0. Okay, now we put a semicolon here, and now we want to square root this. In order to square root something, you are going to need to use math.sqrt. This is just how things are in Java. We can pass 25 in as our argument. So now what this right here would do is it would square root 25. However, even though the computer square roots 25, this doesn't really do anything. Yes, the computer runs the mathematical operation of, okay, take 25 and square root it and get 5. But what does it do with that 5? It does nothing. It just ignores it. If you want to store that 5, what you're going to need to do is do exactly what we did earlier and write 25 equals, and this will assign this 5 to the variable 25. Similarly, we can also raise things to the power of x, y, z, whatever you want. So for that, we do math.pow, and then we would type in our base. So what if we want to raise 5 to the second power, which should get us 25? This is how we do it. And then last but not least, what if we want to take the absolute value of something? So what if we create an integer variable called int negative equals -1? What if we want this variable to become positive? Well, we could reassign it using the following code: negative equals, because we're reassigning this variable, and then we would use math.abs, which is short for absolute value, and then pass in negative as the argument. And of course, don't forget that semicolon. So now you've learned some very simple mathematical operations and how to declare and assign variables in Java. With our next tutorial, I hope to examine print statements. I hope to see you then. Thanks for watching.